Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And yeah, you don't need to tell me that this is a little late. I know it's late. I got tied up with a number of stupid things this past month, plus solo reviews, the anniversary, the mid-year video. I just want to get something close to getting caught up here. So alright, let's get on the pulse. So we got 10 albums on the docket. Let's go back and start with, from Rebecca Black. Rebecca Black was evil.
Ready to dive in the deep end. This time it's gonna be different. I'm getting back with my girlfriend.
So let's not do what every mainstream publication that covers this EP does and be all surprised that the girl that made Friday is now making more distinct and charged hyperpop. Those who've been paying attention, they've seen her on this path, working with acts in this lane for the past couple of years beyond her last pop EP in 2017. This was just a matter of time. And as someone who never really got on board with the Friday hatedom, because I know way too much about the skeevy assembly line process and how pop songs like that are made, especially for younger artists who aren't in the industry proper, I want to give this a fair shot. And, well, okay, like with Slater, it's a more accessible brand of hyperpop, where the production feels considerably better balanced and mastered, but where Slater went into sharper, sexually charged bangers and a lot of 2000s influence, Rebecca Black opted for a more somber tone, with shuddering, squonking synths, and a slightly more reserved, melancholic approach in some of the watery keys, and her vocals coaxed through more gentle, robotic refinement. And you know, that kind of makes sense for the short arc of this EP. Rebecca Black plays the girl who has to end things with a partner, and in between trying to recast the story as better in her own mind to then regretfully watching from the sidelines as the ex will process it, only then to eventually wind up spiraling back into that ex's life. It gives the project some nuance and maturity that I didn't really expect, but I'm really happy that I found. I just wish that the rest of this landed more impact for me. For a hyperpop EP that runs less than 20 minutes, I really wanted to be able to take away from it a stronger melodic hook or two beyond the vocal line, or a note of clattering, visceral impact that we've seen in her collaboration with other acts in the scene right now. I mean, this is certainly well structured, I think it's pretty good, and the instrumental solos across Girlfriend and Personal have some charm, but it doesn't quite stand out as strongly as I was hoping, and honestly it can be kind of forgettable in patches. Very solid 6 out of 10 though. I do wish I liked it a little bit more. Next up from 17, Your Choice.
Can we stay together? Can we stay together? I'm a fool in love for you. 내 맘을 네 곁에 forever. 네 곁에 forever.
Now, as some of you already know, I actually reviewed 17's Semicolon EP last year, and I generally liked it in K-pop for the above-average production and remarkably tasteful genre pivots. So now back with another bite-sized project this year, clocking about 20 minutes, I can't say I like this nearly as much. And unfortunately, it ties back to something that I observed when I covered Semicolon, that their best materials when they did their own thing, not go for obvious trend chasing. But across this project, there's more clunky and repetitive English language hooks, more wiry and underpowered trap beats, more flagrant gummy auto-tune, and less of a focus on the grooves that made this band so distinctive for me. It's a bad sign that when we get Game Boy, there are Bitcoin and NFT references that already feel forced and corny before the song is oversaturated with a lot of tinny chipmunk vocals. Now thankfully by the end, they pulled it around for the 90s R&B pastiche Same Dream, Same Mind, Same Night, which actually has some really pretty harmonies, and they remind me that when 17 class it up, they do punch above a lot of their peers, but when you realize that most of these are just some pretty basic love songs, might be too little too late. Gotta say it. I don't know, if you're into the more forceful, in-your-face flash of modern K-pop, you might find a few cuts that are worth checking out, but this is not 17 at their best. Strong 5 out of 10. Not gonna lie, kinda let down by this one, I have to say. Next up from Garbage, No Gods, No Master.
No master goes to play. I make all the same mistakes.
I'll admit going back and re-listening through Garbage's albums throughout the 90s to the turn of the millennium is kind of surreal for me. Falling at the tangled intersection of alternative rock and late 90s electronica with a smattering of goth and industrial that was more chic stylism than among the true believers or underground. They were more pop their entire run with just enough edginess and good hooks to win a lot of acclaim then and snag nostalgia now. But there is a reason they tend to slip out of most conversations of that era, because even their early work sounds pretty dated, especially in the content and presentation, and it's kind of hard to escape the feeling that they were always a lot more style than substance, and that can age quickly. And after that era, they were never quite able to recapture the 90s alchemy. In the next 2 decades, really, projects wound up scattered in genre, but often well composed enough to hold together, but they didn't wind up that memorable. And spoiler alert, mostly true with this project too. For the record, I'm only covering the standard edition, not the extra 8 songs tacked on to make this over an hour. Garbage albums tend to run long as it is, and you know what, even the standard edition, this is not an exception. But I also feel like I'm probably the wrong person to talk about Garbage at this point, because in finding the middle ground between more percussion-heavy synth pop, a lot of modern alternative rock that's obvious looking back to the 90s, and a dash of industrial and goth rock, they kind of don't synthesize the greatest strengths of any of those subgenres, and just having decent hooks and above average production, albeit lacking in some of the more potent atmosphere, I'm not sure that's enough for me. And yeah, it's been true about Garbage for years now. They're a very solid introduction to these genres, but once you're in, unless you're nostalgic, there aren't always a lot of reasons to go back. Now, I do find it hilarious just how many critics are praising this as genre pushing, when in reality, it's not close to the industrial or alternative scene that's really moving the needle these days, no matter how many layers they slam on top of that sax sound on Anonymous XXX, or the bells on A Woman Destroyed, or that flagrant post-punk riff on Flippin' the Bird. You know what, even if said scene is actively pulling from the 90s and 2000s, this is not experimental. And you know what, I think there's 2 other factors that make this feel kind of dated. The first being that the album is trying to sound very smoky and cool and hold on to that transgressive edge, and it's just gotten way less convincing for me. Half because Shirley Manson can feel like a bit of a limited emotive presence, and half because this album has nothing close to real distorted crunch, especially in the underweight percussion. The other problem is that in between all the self-flagellating angst and their usual spate of faux goth hookup jams, Garbage are trying to get a little bit more political and conscious on this album. And that's not a bad idea. They had snippets where they were trying to be a little bit more forward-thinking in their heyday, if you read between the lines. But again, this is a band that's probably known most for style over substance, and it kind of definitely shows through here. If anything, I'm kind of reminded of Marina's project from earlier this year, where you can definitely tell the intentions are in the right place, with songs like The Men Who Rule the World or Waiting for God, later followed up pretty well by the title track and playing in similar themes, or the revenge fantasy of A Woman Destroyed, and especially Godhead. And you know what? It just feels like it's a painfully surface approach to all these topics. Distilling it all down to lines about dicks feels way clumsier and a lot less transgressive than it should in the age of black dresses, special interest, and backwash. Especially given that song was one of the best industrial-leaning grooves on this album. But let's be real here. At this point, Garbage has nothing left to prove, certainly to me. They're on their own label, they're firmly entrenched within their own sound, they're playing to an audience of diehards who want that nostalgic kick, so if I'm generally lukewarm on it, who cares? Light 6 out of 10, pretty much just for the fans. Take that for what it's worth. Next up from Mike, Disco.
Dummy, if you talk bad, I'm getting paid back, dummy. Why you trying to hang? You should say that money in my same bag. Niggas couldn't take that from me.
So I've seen how other music critics have stepped in it when it comes to talking about this New York lo-fi rapper, so I wanted to make sure I did my homework going through his entire back catalog ahead of time, and with many a listen to Uncommon NASA and Billy Woods, I'm used to a lot of thorny, tangled, very cerebral hip-hop in this territory. And that's what kind of threw me was how relatively straightforward Mike wound up. Yeah, his production was textured and clattering, and showed some touches of jazzy experimentation, but his delivery, a lot of his wordplay, was pretty plain-spoken and honest, pretty easy to figure out. Where the Earl Sweatshirt comparison was inevitable, but not exactly a bad thing. Now, I don't think I was precisely wowed by any of the projects of his I heard. I get the atmosphere, the texture, the raw appeal, but the stuff that I gravitate to more is the more layered and literate stuff, where most of Mike's work felt pretty fragmented, occasionally a little undercooked, especially as things got slower and more turgid and rough on later albums. And I didn't dislike any of them. I wanted to give this a fair shot, and, well, it's interesting, I will say that. There's still a very autobiographical and shaggy feel to this project, as the beats will trudge across the sample loops, struggling to stay on key, and Mike's very conversational drawl. But said samples are a little brighter in their choice of vocal snippets and melodic fragments, which along with the meandering bars, they do translate to a reluctant optimism that helps us feel a little bit more accessible, even if the project absolutely runs long, and the possibility of getting a fully composed hook is kind of a pipe dream. But here's the thing. I understand that the rougher, lo-fi presentation is supposed to be more organic, more homegrown, reinforce the plain-spoken, basic, outsider perspective, and yet I feel like it could have gotten there without some of the most inconsistent mixing and mastering I've heard since Blues 2010's output. It's most distracting around how the vocal fidelity never feels consistent or well placed in the mix compared to all the samples, and while the warmer tones mean I can tolerate it a little bit longer, it feels a lot less avant-garde and more of a clumsy experiment in pushing away the audience, where the dividends start to dry up pretty fast, especially when it doesn't really augment Mike's emotive power as an MC. Look, if the mixing is such a persistent distraction, it's gonna be kind of hard for me to care what he has to say, especially when he's kind of a flat presence behind the mic. And here, if some of the deflection might be part of the point, it feels like less of an excuse in comparison with his more downbeat albums where it was absolutely the point. What's frustrating is I do think Mike's a pretty good MC. There's a self-aware plainness to his angst and depression, where the near persistent weed smoke is untangling all the revelations, especially amidst the samples from his late mother, from which you can tell he is trying so hard to build his inspiration to keep going, look for more, be more aspirational, especially as he's conscious of the weight his previous very depressed work brought, and he wants to feel better. Endgame, great example of that. Now, I don't know if where Mike goes from here is set up to be all that interesting for me. The few moments of flexing and bragging, they don't really grip me at all, and they fit this production even less. But to bring it all around, I feel like Mike is starting to hit the edges of this niche of lo-fi hip-hop, especially if he doesn't want to wallow in the depression anymore. And while I can definitely appreciate the textural experiences and the vibes off this, and indeed some of the writing, the issues in the production, the execution, the refinements, they prevent me from liking it more. So, solid 6 out of 10. I get the niche for this. No, it's not really for me. I do hear potential to be more like this in the future. I appreciate that, at least. Next up, from Lucy Dacus, Home Video.
Hot blood in my pulsing veins, heavy memories weighing on my brain. Hot and heavy in the basement of your parents' place.
Guess I'm just working my way through the members of Boy Genius one by one here, where I wind up liking but not loving their material, otherwise this could have sounded really wrong. Well, after reviewing Phoebe Bridgers last year and Julian Baker this year, Lucy Dacus was the last on my list, so I went to her back catalog and, well damn, colored me a little bit surprised how muscular and punchy her 2016 debut No Burden was, anchored in those thick, roiling guitars that flattered her deeper vocals and canny writing pretty effectively. And that's before Man on a Wall became the sort of galloping indie rock stomper that if I had heard this album 5 years ago, would have easily had a shot to make my favorite songs of 2016. Now, I do think Historian from 2018, it's a little bit more expansive and refined, but I'm not sure it has the snarled, heavy immediacy of her debut, even if it is still pretty damn impressive, and has me wishing that I was reviewing her back then too. So, suffice to say, I now have expectations for this. And yeah, absolutely, great album. It has me kicking myself yet again that I wasn't listening to more Lucy Dacus, but it's also the sort of album that has me convinced that she is building towards a stronger project in the future. The mixes are larger and have picked up some thicker, roiling synths riding off the guitars that might not have that same burly crunch as her earlier work, although the more rambunctious impact of First Time, it is a welcome callback to that, but also the coursing grooves and the acoustic texture at this album's loudest moments, even to the point of feeling a little bit blown out and kind of clunky. But you can also tell that's intended to create some oppressively loud spots on VBS and Triple Dog Dare that are played for stark contrast against the more spacious moments, similar to the intentionally distancing usage of auto-tune on Partner in Crime, which I actually really liked in an Imogen Heap-esque parallel, as Lucy Dacus tries to bend the picture a bit to seem older when she was dating someone who was older. Now, I will say the album starts meandering pretty fast. There are momentum issues here, but you can tell that was by design when you get to the songwriting. The album is called Home Video, and it often feels like sifting through old photographs and memories when she's gone home for a spell, where she's grown up enough and changed to be very honest with herself and her old friends and her own flings, but also aware about how going back to that old environment in rural Virginia can bring forth some of those old emotions. And that lends the album a lot of pathos. If anything, it feels a lot like the evolution of what Katie Pruitt did last year with Expectations, especially in the naked explorations of religion and queerness, except Lucy Dacus' writing feels more self-assured and cutting in her insight, and less interested in the glamour or romance of the scene. I was reminded more often than not of Laurie McKenna at her most blunt, and that is high praise indeed, but as such it's a harder listen. Cartwheel has her friends growing up chasing boys and her feeling betrayed or left behind. Christine is an open confrontation of a friend that Lucy Dacus thinks is settling down for the wrong partner, a future that she herself could see occurring in between the lines on Please Stay, where it'd be so much easier to be normal. VBS is a starkly honest portrayal of her first boyfriend at Bible camp. All the more cutting on Brando, where she cuts into another guy's artsy pretentiousness absolutely effortlessly and includes the genuinely excellent line, "You call me cerebral, I didn't know what you meant, but now that I do, would it have killed you to call me pretty instead?" So many emotional layers there. And Thumbs might be the most devastating song that she's ever written or performed, where she goes with a friend to confront that friend's estranged father, and the layers of sympathetic pain and rage she unpacks is legit heartbreaking. Following that song with Going, Going, Gone suggests that what she's looking to do most on this project is challenge the traditional cycles and expectations of life, especially in a more religious, smaller community. Those expectations of life, relationships, gender, sexuality, that it can be so tempting to fall into so quickly, and she doesn't exclude herself in that framing, which is why the album starts on Hot and Heavy, why those friends couldn't have left and taken more chances like she did, but then ends on Triple Dog Dare with the single diversion into fantasy, where she tries to convince a high school friend to run away together, where they could break that cycle. And yeah, it's easily her most varied and impressive album to date. Very solid, 8 out of 10, absolutely worth more attention. I want to see where she goes from here. There's a lot more on those horizons. Next up from Jxdn, Tell Me About Tomorrow. You know, with that Kenny Hoopla and Travis Barker collab, I had expectations. Yeah, they went unmet, but hey, it's a thought that counts. That was not the case with Jxdn, who is a TikTok star who at one point was part of the Sway House, it really depresses me that I know what that is, who started making music that hit the rock charts, and what do you know, there's Travis Barker again, and hey look, he brought Machine Gun Kelly and Ian Dior in tow. I hope that's why y'all grasp why I was kind of skeptical about this. And I had every right to be, because everyone who said that Machine Gun Kelly owed tickets to my downfall to Travis Barker, enabling him to rip off Blink-182, they need to hear this kid. A Wasted Year, it's just a flagrant riff of Feeling This. That's way more obvious than anything MGK did. Shame it doesn't stop there, because in between the atmospherics that are pulling wholesale from tones that Post Malone and Trippie Redd of all people are doing better, and the rap moments where Black Bear's influence and co-writing is obvious, and that's not a good thing, and you realize just how many mechanisms that Travis Barker is putting in place in order to muscle this kid's brand of pop punk into the spotlight with a pre-built TikTok audience to put him over the top. And I include song structure in that, as most of these songs are distilled down to the rawest basics possible. That's not punk, that's an obvious play for commercial attention and going viral. And you know, I never felt that with Machine Gun Kelly. Yeah, I know, that's probably surprising for me to say, especially as he's a pretty bad singer, but he's got charisma and presence that all the autotune here can't prop up for Jxdn. And even though I would agree, Tickets to My Downfall, it's dumb, it's derivative, but there's enough honest and mostly genuine moments for him and a palpable desperation of the saving throw that if it had failed, Diddy would have killed the record deal at Bad Boy that lends Machine Gun Kelly some populism. Paradoxically, it helps you root for him, even if you know he's never going to be able to pull it off again. Jxdn, meanwhile, is just as dumb, possibly even more derivative in the content and vocal style, but without that added veneer of populism, all the flaws just race to the forefront. The production is overcompressed to a frankly obscene degree, stripped of any real impact, and severely lacking in punchier groove. Jxdn is a singer with no distinctive bite or texture to his vocals, and his slurred over rock star moments do not impress me whatsoever. And you can also tell he tries to mimic his guest stars whenever they show up, which is very revealing, like with Machine Gun Kelly on Wannabe. And look, you can't tell me there's anything close to nuance in this brand of flagrantly high school melodrama, which, fine, I get how this might work for its target audience, but I grew up in the last wave of this. I remember when it had more nuance, punch, and impact, especially in the painfully shallow emo moments, even in the 2000s. Now, Olivia Rodrigo's rock moments hit harder than this. But the larger problem is that outside of the intro and the interlude, this is 16 songs, and given how basic it all feels, it starts getting really forgettable fast. It's a bad sign, probably the biggest standout. It's the Blink-182 ripoff in A Wasted Year. Outside of that, it's a 4 out of 10. Give me 1 minute, title track, the bass line of So What. Probably the best groove here. You can skip the rest. Next up from the Mountain Goats, Darken Here.
This tiny sector can't contain me.
I'm not sure what it was about that last Mountain Goats album, Getting Into Knives, that hooked me more than everyone else. I don't know, maybe I'm just a sucker for the writing, leading into such a feral and dilapidated place along with the rougher production. Maybe it was how there were enough slow burn moments to really suck me in. Maybe it was listening to it that fall alongside the newest Clipping album for a thematic synergy that week that gave them both so much replay value. Anyway, folks have been way more supportive and way more excited about this newest Mountain Goats project, highlighting its immediacy, how a lot of the songs were way better than ever, which makes things kinda awkward when I come here and say, I wasn't really feeling this nearly as much as I wanted to be. Yeah, I'm as shocked as anyone, but I have given this a ton of listens, really trying to find that greatness that has hooked so many people, say that this is so much better than the Mountain Goats' previous work. And look, it certainly is very good. I'd only say this is on the cusp of greatness, and to my shock, a lot of that might be rooted in the songwriting and themes. Yeah, John Darnielle has described this project as a sister album to Getting Into Knives, recorded around the same time. And I definitely hear some of that in the bleaker imagery, the increasingly haunted weirdness, but there's a different flavor to the darkness here that honestly reminds me a lot more of In League with Dragons or Goths, where the album might cloak itself in some of those tones and some of that imagery, but in reality feels a fair bit more human and normal beneath it all, except minus all the intensely detailed settings that gave those two albums so much character for me. Yeah, I dug the layered biblical detachment of Mobile, but it's one of the exceptions, it's not the rule. I also think a major factor is a sense of urgency. An album like Getting Into Knives, it was all unstable, feral edges drilling into that territory, where the melancholy kind of came in on the side, whereas Darken Here is kind of already in that dreary space and just getting more comfortable there, settling in, which is reflected in the instrumentation picking up more of those jazzy arranged elements from Goths, but with a bit more of a refined, realized tone, the free jazz freakout on Lizard Suit accepted. But that was also an album that was acutely aware of how the goth scene was ossified in time, where age and the ongoing normal life might have been the greater dangers. Whereas this album doesn't quite have that contrast point or that added level of artifice in the storytelling, which has the feel of going down a very familiar and likable but meandering road with less points that stick out. It's not like this album has a Rain in Soho here either. So what we wind up with are a selection of increasingly scattered but pretty damn good Mountain Goat songs that could be slotted among the slightly lesser cuts of any of the last three albums. Might be more accessible for sure, as there's less of that deflective artifice, but I'm not sure it's better for it? And that's kind of a shame, because when it comes to the production and a lot of the instrumentation and hooks on this album, it might be one of their most varied and propulsive in some time. I get why people are getting into it. The pulsating gallop of the bass, organ, and snares on the Destruction of the Kola Super Deep Borehole Tower, and the piano accented title track, the soft rock of Mobile, the great slow burn of the slow parts of death metal songs. But when you realize that the majority of even the best songs here, they run long, the momentum starts flagging, and there's just a little bit less that pulls me back in the lyrics. So while I don't think there's any obvious standouts that'll stuck me in forever, there's just enough great songs to edge this into an extremely light 8 out of 10. John Darnielle is a great enough songwriter, he's got that quality. I don't think I'm going to go back to this in the same way as their best, but hey, when the Mountain Goats have this level of high quality, someone's just managing expectations. I can go with that. Next up, from Spelling, The Turning Wheel.
That never goes out. I've got all this desire in a world of doubt.
So, guess who feels very late to the party here? Look, in all due fairness, I feel like I should have reviewed Mozzie Fly 2 years ago. It was on my radar, somehow slipped through the cracks, but with the surge of critical acclaim directed at Spelling's newest album, especially courtesy of one fellow colleague on this website, I figured I would do my due diligence and catch up on her entire back catalog. And I'll admit I'm not sure how I feel about them. A very fractured but haunting tone, somewhere between vintage darkwave, modern R&B, and art pop. She was certainly intriguing enough to hold my interest, but I wasn't sure I was fully hooked yet. Now granted, hearing that she had once again expanded her sound and really amplified that Kate Bush influence this time around, that was intriguing. I did want to hear this. And yeah, you know what? Happy to join the consensus. This is pretty great. Definitely Spelling's best work to date, but also, like Lucy Dacus, the sort of album that opens up so many doors for so many new sounds that I would love to hear her approach. So much potential, especially when you realize that Spelling self-produced this project and it sounds gorgeous. The impeccable balance and exact richness of tone you love to hear in baroque pop. It's just beautiful. Now, as much as I deeply love Kate Bush's catalog, and you can absolutely hear the influence in the theatricality, the more ornate compositions, just how well the synths are integrated opposite the classical arrangements alongside the writing that can effectively hit the balance between pop songs and baroque poetry. I'll admit it, in certain patches, Kate Bush's production can sound a little dated, especially in the 1980s. And well, there's actually some of that here in some of the programmed percussion and some of the flattened or oilier synth tones. The cleaner and more expansive mix overall, to say nothing of the more textured bass lines and the percussion grooves, they definitely help Spelling make this sound her own. Kate Bush would not have cut a song like Revolution, let me tell you, and that really helps this album's uniqueness. Maybe not really transcending the influence, Spelling's vocals can be really damn pretty, especially with the increased use of choirs and multi-tracking, but there is a bit of a shy mysticism to her delivery that in certain moments could maybe afford to be sold a little harder, a little sharper, really drive those theatrical moments home to match all of her arrangements. But you know, that's minor, it's not so obtrusive that it gets distracting, and moments like the romanticism of Always, the soulful piano work on the title track, the fantastic swell of the hook on Awaken, the gothic psychedelia of Queen of Wands, and anytime Lisa Reed opens up to just shred on the guitar, that hits retro and swings right through it to goddamn awesome. And you know, while there is a part of me that prefers a slightly wordier brand of baroque pop, I like my Julia Holter and Joanna Newsom, I can't deny there's a thematic richness to this album. So much of the project circles a yearning for transcendence over that turning wheel of time, but enough of a grounded reality by looking inwards to pull forth the black girl magic and the music to build and work it down here. In a way, it kind of evades my analysis, as magic as ought to do, less the quantitative, more the qualitative, which kind of makes me wish I was a little bit more enraptured with the writing and the performances as a whole. But hey, I know to recognize greatness when I hear it. This is something special. Solid 8 out of 10, really impressive stuff. Next up from Doja Cat, Planet Her. You know, the one very convenient thing about running a show where you talk about the Hot 100 on a weekly basis is if you wind up covering an album bomb from an artist on the show, reviewing the album itself winds up pretty straightforward. And man, I wish it was better. Unfortunately, a lot of the charting moments are the most interesting on this project, but also highlight how Doja Cat sounds really overmanaged by Kemosabe and pulled in a few too many directions. Now, she's got a jack-of-all-trades skill set in terms of a pretty good singing voice, although her baby-voiced higher register can get really grating pretty fast, not gonna lie, and her more cartoonish rapping style, and a very online, very horny, very manic sense of humor. Just a damn shame the album doesn't really play to that strength, especially given how much of this album will flit across genres from Afrobeat to R&B to more conventional pop to stabs at cloud rap and trap that could really use producers other than Dr. Luke to make the mix sound more colorful, or at least match what she is, or at least give her some more defined, distinctive melodies to work with instead of mixes that feel so hollowed out and spare and interchangeable with the rest of the field. But the problems unfortunately run deeper than that, in that Doja Cat can be a bit of a chameleon in terms of her presence and vibe on certain songs, or at least she tries a little too hard to emulate her peers rather than accentuate her own uniqueness. And the frequent shoutouts and most of the guest collaborators don't really help with this, where it had become way too obvious who she is mimicking, especially when guests like The Weeknd and JID could make for a lot more interesting collaborations than the ones we got. And sadly, I don't think the writing does much to elevate her regardless. Oh, she will have moments where she sounds convincingly sexy, like Naked or Love to Dream or Kiss Me More with SZA, or where she will get silly in the right way. I enjoy Get Into It Ya way more than I probably should, but you're not gonna get any deeper on any of these songs, and it makes the album feel really thin and kind of underwhelming to me. Yeah, the brooding 2000s R&B era alone, probably the closest to depth we got on the album, and it is a highlight. This should feel way more interesting than it is, and without any truly great songs, strong 5 out of 10. Believe it or not, I wanted to like this more. And finally, from Maroon 5, Jordi.
It's never gonna be nobody's love. Never gonna need nobody's love but yours.
Look, don't blame me for this. Sometimes you need the utterly generic silent majority act to boost the video for the algorithm, especially if it's late. At least that's not as cynical as, well, this album. Look, at this point, it's an utterly dead meme how unessential and past their prime Maroon 5 is, where I have to assume the only reason mainstream critics are bothering to cover it is that it's an easy target. That's how dead the meme is. And thus when we get a new album, I have no idea why a patron requested this at all, probably assuming that I'm gonna get all cranky about it. But even then, it's not worth the effort, especially considering their last album was called The Red Pill Blues, and it sucked harder than this. But you know, even if this is a little bit better and showcasing slightly better grooves and less outright awful decisions, it is shockingly inessential and devoid of personality. And when you consider where Maroon 5 started, I grew up with this band where they at least had a distinctive tone. Even if it wasn't your thing, there was more there. And it even extends to Adam Levine, where you can tell outside of his voice, he's just a cipher on these songs, whereas behind the scenes songwriters are more recognizable than he is. Not a good sign when one of said songwriters is Black Bear, look who's back. And I could talk about how programmed and yet formless this album feels, with so many beats just hanging minus any sort of distinctive instrumental melody or some utterly lifeless and reverb swamped out reggae that Magic would laugh at. This album was recorded with none of the band actually in the same room together, and wow, it sounds like it. And the chintzy as hell vocal mixing around Adam Levine really doesn't help, or how the content just feels beyond basic, or how Stevie Nicks completely phones in her vocals on Remedy, or really that Maroon 5's existence and popularity for the past decade or so is a searing indictment of how derivative mush is often the most common byproduct of modern late period capitalism and not unique innovation. And what does that really say about the silent majority audience that will still buy and consume that? But really, is Maroon 5 even worth that conversation? do we care that much? What I find most interesting about Jordi is how it's even starting to sound self-aware about the hollowness and the legacy. Relationships have ended. We're looking back on what is lost and what remains. Where I'll just say this, the inclusion of verses from both the late Nipsey Hussle and Juice WRLD, they feel really tacky and a bit gross, especially when you can recognize Adam Levine's navel-gazing and corporate shilling in the larger context of the project. Yes, I get it was named after the late manager. It never comes up on the album, and that's it. There's so little to recognize. It's more brand management than album. It's not even all that fun in its disposability, and if you can't deliver that, what's the point? Let me put it like this. The best song here is Convince Me Otherwise with Her. It sounds like Tame Impala making a 90s Quiet Storm ballad, and Her probably could have done it herself. We'd all have been better for it. Strong 3 out of 10. You don't need to care about Maroon 5 anymore. Just move on. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Kind of ashamed to end on a downer note, but hey, it's the one that's gonna get the most traffic. You gotta draw the attention where it's worth. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you have comments, leave them down there below. I'm sure I said something to annoy you. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, or potentially get into my Discord server to talk to me, or just help support the channel in general, link to my Patreon right over there. Once again, please don't feel obligated in any of this. It's tough times, I understand, but the option's available if you're interested. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.